Hello. This is the continuation of my summary of Alistair Parker's book, The Second World War, a Short History. This one dealing with North Africa in 1942. So it's part of chapter 7, which deals with the end of German expansion. We talked about the Atlantic in the last video, North Africa today, and then we'll talk about the situation in the Soviet Union in the next two videos. Parker notes two constant factors in the campaigns that I'm going to talk about in this particular video. One is the desert itself, which forms the background to much of the fighting. One of the German generals described the desert as a tactician's paradise and a quartermaster's hell. That is that if you're a general trying to work out what to do, you can do all sorts of things in the desert. But you always have the problems of supplies. Every victorious advance lengthened the lines of communication and supplies. Every retreat shortened them, making a counteroffensive easier. The second constant factor was that the Germans in the desert employed better tactics than their British opponents. In particular, they were able to integrate their artillery, tanks, and infantry in a way which the British found difficult to do. Indeed, there was sometimes mutual resentment between British infantry and British armour. Then we have the role of Erwin Rommel, the German commander. Both sides saw him as being a brilliant general. He was a major advantage for the Axis. His leadership was energetic and his reactions quick. Some of the British praised him as kind of Superman, though the British military commander Auchinleck deplored such talk as bad for morale. Even the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in the House of Commons referred to Rommel as a great general who was daring and skillful. In terms of equipment, the German tanks were initially superior to those of the British. Hitler reportedly referred to British tanks as tin, but in September 1942, the British obtained American Shermans. The British Crusader was undergunned, thin-skinned, and unreliable. Their tank guns were inadequate, and in 1942, Auchinleck stated that he would need a superiority of 3 British tanks to German to match the Germans' technical and tactical superiority. Then, in terms of anti-tank guns, the British 2-pounder was ineffective, and the British 8th Army only began to replace them with 6-pounders in 1942. The German 88mm anti-aircraft gun was still superior to anything the Allies had when used as an anti-tank weapon. Then in the air, the German Messerschmitt 109F easily outclassed all British fighters until the Spitfire 5 arrived in the spring and summer of 1942. Supply was always a decisive factor. Both sides needed tens of thousands of tons of supplies of fuel, ammunition, and rations every month, and more was needed for their base troops and lines of communication. But whilst the British had a comparatively safe line of supply from Britain and also the United States and India, the Axis could only be supplied across the Mediterranean, where there was potential interference from submarines, surface ships, and aircraft. For the British, as long as there was sufficient shipping, then the delays of the Cape route to Egypt were manageable. For the British, it was necessary to hold on to the Middle East, both to defend the oil fields and their access to oil, protect the supply routes to the Soviet Union through Iran, and help maintain India as a base for the containment of Japan and the support of China. These objectives encouraged American support for British defense. In 1942, it seemed possible that the German forces from Russia and Africa could meet up in Iraq or Iran, or even that they could link up with the Japanese invasion of India. Such fears gave great priority to Allied allocation of shipping and supplies, for the British Army in the Middle East. British attacks on the Italian and German supply lines relied on interception of Italian radio signals from July 1940 onwards to be effective. Even though this gave them advance notice of almost every sailing, last-minute changes did occur, often in response to British actions, and the British had to arrange aerial spotting of ships in order to conceal their success in code breaking. From 1941 through to late in 1942, the situation remained very uncertain in North Africa, with both sides pushing forward at one time and then being pushed back at another. In September 1940, the Italians had advanced 65 miles into Egypt, but by early 1941, the British had pushed them back 340 miles. Then, reinforced with German troops under Rommel, the Axis forces advanced again, but were pushed back again. The shift of much of the Luftwaffe to the Soviet front in the summer of 41 made it easier for the British. And in July and October 41, about 1/5 of Axis cargoes to North Africa were lost, and in November, 62%. Then, however, extra German aircraft were sent to Sicily. The German submarine presence in the Mediterranean was increased, and Italian mini-subs launched devastating attacks on British ships in Alexandria, sinking a battleship and 3 cruisers and putting 2 more battleships out of action. Devastating air raids were also launched against the key British staging post of Malta, and in early 1942, the Axis supply situation was excellent. Accordingly, Rommel was able to build up his tank force and push back the British. In June 1942, Rommel won a series of battles, and the British and South African troops holding Tobruk were forced to surrender. He reached El Alamein on the 29th of June, but was blocked from further advance towards Alexandria. During 1942, the Malta base was secured by the British, who also recommenced heavy interruption of Axis supplies to North Africa. American Sherman tanks, superior to those of the British, were also received, along with self-propelled guns and aircraft, and troop numbers were built up, and a new British commander, Montgomery, was appointed. This is Montgomery, commander of the British 8th Army from August 42 through to May 43. The final British victory began in October 1942, when the British 8th Army attacked the Axis forces, that's the Italians and Germans, on the 23rd of October. They had a superiority about that time in the numbers of their men, their tanks, their artillery, and aircraft. The Axis were by then facing supply difficulties, including fuel shortages, and at a crucial moment Rommel himself was taken sick. He quickly returned once the British advance began, but was only able to fight a static defensive battle. After 11 days, on the 4th of November, he ordered a fighting retreat. Under Montgomery, the British began an advance of what eventually was 1,500 miles, which drove the Axis forces out of Egypt and Libya entirely. This was the first definitive German retreat on land. Other developments were very important. On the 7th of November 42, British and American troops landed in French Morocco and Algeria in preparation for their advance in Tunisia, into what is now Tunisia. And on the 20th of November, the Great Soviet Offensive began in the Stalingrad sector, which of course was another crucial turning point. So thank you very much for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement, without whom I wouldn't be able to make these videos. If you are able to support my channel, I'm very appreciative. Do like, comment and share on the videos. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give Patreon and, for the moment, PayPal links below if you want to provide practical support. And next week we'll talk about the war on the Eastern Front. Have a good day.